So those of you who know what Common Sense Bodybuilding is all about will know that I am an advocate of the safer use model of anabolic steroids. The safer use model basically means using the minimum effective dose of each drug to achieve the desired outcome with minimal side effects. But lately Victor's been getting himself into all kinds of social media wars with respected influencers and voices within the bodybuilding and anabolics use community. Is there a community for anabolics use? You know what I mean. People who basically know their stuff about gear. Whether or not these Instagram feuds are detrimental to his reputation is a topic for another time, but I'll let you into a little secret. Yes, they are. But one thing stuck out to me, and that's the fixation on aromatase inhibitors within bodybuilding, their place or lack of, and what really is the safest way to control estrogen. So today we're going to dispel some myths. We're going to talk about the safer use model and why it might actually mean you're using more gear than last time. Victor Black's models are basically a textbook way to use anabolics. What I will say is that there is a caveat to be made when you're looking at a model versus putting that model into practice in reality. The way we can look at safer use models is basically like the golden scenario. If you had all the time in the world, if you could do it perfectly, how would you do it? Well, the Victor Black safer use model is what you would follow. However, when you start to take into account the career span of bodybuilders, the timeframes we're working with, and the fact that results kind of outweighs health to most of us, the scales start to turn against sticking strictly to that model. This is why when I talk about drugs on this channel, I always try to take the safer use model and factor in the realities of being a competitive bodybuilder. Because a big component of the safer use model is the risk that you're willing to tolerate, and this is an aspect that most people do not take into account. John Jewett recently did a video where he was reviewing IFBB Pro level cycles, and some of these cycles were going to 5, 6, 7 grams a week, absolutely absurd volumes. But even the lower cycles that he was going through, sitting around the 3 gram mark, would be seen as obscene to a lot of the general public. It's kind of acceptable. When you're talking about a certain level of bodybuilding where the reward goes up so much, then you have to move your risk factors accordingly, or else you're simply not going to be able to compete at the top level. Bodybuilding is a difficult sport to ascend through the ranks in. Once you get to the top of the mountain, it's all about legacy and success. And when that point comes, there will always be somebody willing to take the risk that you won't necessarily. For example, in the safer use model, they state that there would be no real reason to run tren above, say, 100 to 150 milligrams per week. But when we're talking about the Olympia stage, would an extra 50 to 100% of that drug make a noticeable difference? I'm willing to bet yes. And what it then comes down to is the risk that you as an individual are willing to take. And that will dictate how you utilize the safer use model. People think it's cut and dry. People think these are the doses that you should use, end of. But that's simply not the case. Safer use does give you a fairly stable cycle framework. Your compound selection won't change all that much because it's all about using the most effective clinically studied compounds. Typically they'll consist of testosterone, a DHT derivative, likely a low dose 19-nor, GH, some insulin, and a plethora of health drugs to go alongside it. The compound selection will be sorted for you, but how much of each compound you use is kind of up to you. Now, there will be ratios in terms of how much of a DHT derivative you need to run in order to control the estrogen from the testosterone base and the 19-nor. However, they are just that, ratios, and ratios are scalable. For example, the safer use ratios for a amateur who's never competed before may be the absolute minimal clinical effective dose. However, for an IFBB Pro, the reward has gone up by so much that the risk usually follows suit. And there's also risk in not being competitive. If you're running half the amount of drugs, but you take home 7th versus 1st, then actually the risk-reward ratio may have been better just to do double the drugs and take that first place trophy. Whereas in a first-timers amateur contest, the potential reward or upside of doing something like that would be far, far less. So we've gotten the dosage question out of the way. You can absolutely run higher dose, safer use cycles as long as the design is intelligent and you're still using the minimum dose to match your risk reward profile. Let's take a little bit of a moment to talk about the health misconceptions around anabolics use. For example, first on the list, and we talked about that in the steroid cycles of ruining your gains video, is blast and cruise versus coming off completely. Now, the traditional argument, or the commoner's approach, would be that common sense dictates that coming off anabolics is healthier than staying on them. However, again, let's take that risk-reward ratio into account in our conversations. You are going to spend that time blasting elevated amount of drugs. A portion of that time, the drugs will be titrating up in your system to the dose that you've set. So it takes a little while for them to kick in. And then for a little while afterwards, the drugs will be clearing from your system, still suppressing you and preventing your natural testosterone from coming back. That means that you've got 2 stages at the start and end of a cycle where you're suboptimal. And then afterwards, you're going to spend a period of time regaining your natural testosterone, sitting there with low testosterone, losing your gains. Opposed to that, you could simply lower your dose to a testosterone replacement therapy dose of between 100 and 150 milligrams per week, or if you're part of the Bro Chat podcast, 600 mgs. This keeps a slightly elevated natural equivalent amount of testosterone within your body, preventing all those issues that come with coming off cycle and having crashed testosterone. This also reduces the amount of stress in your body, the androgenic stress, and that one is a tongue twister. You're bringing it down from supraphysiological doses, the stress will naturally reduce, and your health markers will, generally speaking, improve. As much as if you came off completely, well, that's hard to say because it's hard to equivalate the amount of damage coming off would also do to your system during that process, and whether or not simply dropping to TRT would be as safe, safer, or worse for you, but it's pretty safe to say that the difference would be marginal. In fact, Victor Black himself advocates for a first cycle between 12 and 18 months. Now granted, that's using about 200 to 250 milligrams, so this is very much only slightly above natural levels. And by only slightly, I mean like 30% to 100% more than natural levels. But this is because rather than blasting a very high amount of drugs for a short space of time, it makes sense that running a lower amount of stress over a longer period of time would probably be better for your body. It would never overload it and really pummel your health markers. Now this is hypothetical. Needless to say, in clinical trials they haven't done 18-month enhanced anabolic steroid cycles in recreational users or bodybuilders versus a blast and cruise approach. However, still it advocates for the fact, especially when it comes to coming off elevated doses and dropping back down, or trying to take time off for health, actually keeping a little bit of anabolics within the system may be beneficial. And then you've got the case that Victor Black was pulled up on. The issue that people seem to have in terms of aromatase inhibitors. Do they have a place within bodybuilding? Well, in my mind, again, it falls to risk-reward. What is the risk of taking an aromatase inhibitor? Well, an aromatase inhibitor has its own negative side effects health-wise. It will have an impact on your blood markers and it will cause health issues, albeit not massive, but still it has an impact. What upside does it give you? Well, it controls estrogen. That's it. It could potentially crash estrogen into the ground, which would cause you negative health impacts. But granted, it will likely control it if you manage to get the ratio of AI to anabolics correct. Now let's talk about using a DHT derivative like Primo or Mastron. Well, what will that do? So using Primo as an example, of course, the shining star of the anabolics world, or safer use at least, will it have an impact on health? Absolutely yes, but in women it's been studied to be fairly well tolerated up to 1.2 grams a week, so the bar is pretty high for that. Will it control estrogen? Absolutely yes. What else will it do? Well, it will grow muscle, it will improve your aesthetic, and in the case of Primo, it'll improve your mood. You can check out my review on Primo after this to find out more about that wonder drug. So you're being presented with 2 options. Use something which purely achieves the job of modulating your estrogen, which comes with its own suite of side effects. Or utilize something which controls estrogen and builds muscle and will improve your mood and aesthetic. I know which one I'm picking. If you can design your cycle to allow the DHT derivatives or the anabolics within the stack to actually modulate the estrogen instead of having to add something exclusively for that, that is going to be better for you, in my opinion, in terms of overall risk reward. People just get safer use wrong all the time. It's an optimal model which you can apply by taking into account your real life circumstances, your goals, your ambitions, the price you're willing to pay, and then using the model and molding it around those ambitions and your risk profile. It's adaptable, and quite simply, there's no excuse for people not to be using this model in 2022. Is it hella tempting to blast all the drugs, all the fucking 19 NORs, shoot testosterone through the roof, and just blow up like a lot of people do in the industry? Absolutely. It's difficult to resist that temptation, but I have seen over the last couple of years an unreal amount of progress. I've switched to safer use models from a traditional model of anabolics use, using high testosterone and not being as selective with compounds, and I have grown better, I feel better, and I look better. But it is more expensive. Am I some spokesperson or advocate for Victor Black? No, God no. But I appreciate the intelligence within the models and the fact they can be useful when you also take the circumstances and risk profiles into account for a competitive bodybuilding situation. Maybe the reason people think that it's black and white is because they're not willing to think for themselves, and unfortunately it takes some thinking for yourself to apply this correctly and balance trying to become an IFBB Pro before the age of 30, for example, and also not significantly deteriorating your health. Hell, it might not even be possible utilizing these models, but at least they would give you the best shot. So yes, contrary to what would appear to make sense, that coming off would be healthier, actually staying on anabolic steroids may be the better option. And yes, when you factor in the potential reward, using something like Primo or Masteron to modulate estrogen instead of a dedicated aromatase inhibitor may be better for you, or at least it might make it possible to be healthier and successful. What do you think? Does safer use have a place within competitive bodybuilding? Is it even possible to be a successful competitive bodybuilder using these models? Let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.